it took me like a good 10, 12 years to grow out of that and to like figure out how to be financially responsible again.
From Seamwork Magazine, I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories from people who make clothing. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio. So we're taking a break this month, and we thought it would be fun to replay some of our favorite episodes from the archives. I wanted to share this episode with my friend Heather Lewenza of Closet Core Patterns from way back in 2016. I'll never forget visiting Heather at her home in Montreal and hearing all about her life and her career. And what I appreciate most about Heather is that she's just such an open, generous person, and I think you'll love hearing her story. You can find Heather at closetcorepatterns.com or follow Closet Core Patterns on Instagram. We'll see you with brand new episodes in a few weeks, but in the meantime, enjoy this classic interview with Heather. Let me just start by saying, talking about money is hard. It's a little bit of a taboo subject in our culture. It's something most people feel awkward discussing with anyone outside of close friends and family. At the same time, we've all struggled with it. It's either not having enough or spending it too freely, having it sour a relationship or force us to take a terrible job. Late last year, I took a trip to Montreal and had the chance to sit down with my friend Heather Lewenza and talk about money and about work. Heather, if you don't know, she's the designer behind Closet Case Files, another independent pattern company. We talked about the road to being a business owner and how money, spending, and work have changed the course of her life.
I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, which is a very blue-collar town. It's basically like the Detroit of Canada. So yeah, it's just like a very blue-collar working-class town. Like the joke is that it's kind of like a Bruce Springsteen song. And, everybody that I knew for the most part, worked in factories. My mother owned a jewelry store, and my father had more of a white collar job too. But pretty much everybody that we knew was like either working in the automotive industry or were working in jobs that kind of supported the industry. So it was just kind of like a gritty rock and roll kind of place. And I grew up in the latter half of my teen years, I was in the country, but it's the same kind of vibe, just like more rural, but still that kind of like working class community.
Heather's parents split up when she was very young.
And then my mom got remarried when she met her second husband when I was 5. And they were together off and on for 7 years. And it turned out that he was a monster and was quite abusive. So we had a pretty kind of crazy 7 years, moving around a lot.
Watching her mother being victimized by her stepfather changed the way Heather saw things. It informed her feminist ideology as she got older.
He was really brutal alcoholic and kind of battled with his alcoholism for years. So, he would have periods of sobriety where things would be okay, but then he would start drinking again. And so, in terms of abuse, it wasn't horrifying, but it was bad and it was scary. And we definitely had some having to flee in the middle of the night because things got really bad.
Growing up, the family didn't have a lot of resources.
We did not have a lot of money. Because my mom was a single mom and because they had each taken kids on their own. My dad eventually had both of my brothers and my mom had me, that they just decided not to do child support. So they were both kind of struggling single parents trying to support their kids. And, my mom was involved in a family business, but it never did super well. And then she had a huge falling out with my aunt when I was a teenager and left the jewelry store and was so desperate for money that she took in, wasn't quite a pyramid scheme, but it was one of those direct people to people direct businesses where you're selling healthcare. They sold this product called Intra. And so for years she was just trying to make a living selling these healthcare products out of the trunk of her car, basically. So we were dirt poor when I was in high school, dirt poor, thankfully I went to a Catholic high school and we had uniforms because there was just no way that I could have afforded to keep up with all the rich kids that I went to school with. She'd make a pot of soup on Sunday and that would have to last us, a couple days. So we had some lean years, but we were rich in love. I don't really think about my childhood with any kind of sense of deprivation at all.
When she was 13 and just entering adolescence, Heather's mom decided to move the family to the country.
I was so mad because where we lived, it was the closest town and the closest friend that I eventually made was 2 or 3 kilometers away. So you had to ride your bike or hitchhike to go see anybody. And the first couple of years were really rough. But then as I got older, I think I'm grateful for that actually, because I spent a lot of time alone and just became really comfortable in my own company. Like I would sometimes go like a whole weekend without like seeing friends or doing anything. And so I would just read a lot and, watch a lot of movies and watch a lot of TV and like make stuff and, listen to music. And like we lived on the lake. So I would go for walks along the lake and just kind of got used to spending time alone, which I think has served me well as I got older.
After high school, Heather wanted to go to school, but she also needed to work.
I wanted to go to university, and I, like I said, lived in this automotive community, and there was a bunch of big plants, and my uncle was the president of the union at the time. And so he basically hooked me up with this very coveted job working on the line, because with the end goal being that once I had worked full time, I could kind of quit being full-time and then get into this part-time program that you could only get into once you worked full-time. So for my first year of university, I was working full-time midnights in the factories. It was like sometimes it was 5.5 days a week, and then going to night classes with the expectation that at some point this was going to stop and I was going to go to part-time. But I would get frequently laid off. So I would work for 8 months and I would get laid off for 3 months, and I would, work for 6 months and be laid off for 4. So I just ended up kind of sticking with the full-time schedule. So basically my entire university career, there were a couple months where I wouldn't be working if I was laid off, but I would often just work midnights, have this kind of crazy schedule. So my university career was very like work focused, and I didn't, socialize that much. Like I don't really remember having going to toga parties or anything like that. Like it was my life was very off campus. I had my own little circle of friends, but because I had this crazy kind of work life, I didn't really socialize too much on campus. So I had kind of like a weird university experience where I was just going for class and that was it.
What do you think motivated you to work that much? Most kids don't do that.
I was making a lot of money. Like at the time, I think I was making like $30 an hour. So for like an 19-year-old at the time was just like, and for somebody who like grew up really poor, it was just like the most amount of money. Like if I had actually worked full time, I was making $60,000 a year as a 19-year-old, which is completely insane. So it was just really nice. Like I had financial independence, and I moved out right away when I was 19. My mother had my sister when I was 16. So there was like a baby in the house, and I was like, I gotta get it. Like, okay, I'm too old to be at home. So I had my own place. I had my own car. I had like my own savings. And also I just, come from this kind of like workhorse family where you just like, that's what you do. You just work and you just work. That's just what you do. So I never really thought too much about it. It was just kind of what I did. And like I said, because I had these periods of being laid off, I would have months where I wasn't working and I was just focusing on school. So yeah, it was nice. I made a lot of money in those years. I've never made as much money to date. Like as like 34, I still have not made as much money like per year as I made when I was 19 years old working in a factory that killed me.
Why did it kill you? Was it just the labor?
It's the worst. People are not meant to work in factories. They're not meant to do the same repetitive thing 500 times a day. And they're dirty and they're smelly and people are miserable and they're like drunk and smoking pot on their breaks, and everybody was chain smoking. And it was just like, if I smell sometimes like that lubricant that they used in the torque guns, like I get kind of taken back to that, and I just start immediately getting anxious because it's just, you're in this clamoring dark hellhole for 8 hours a day, and all you hear is like crazy machines, and like it was just, yeah, it was horrible. And then just in order to make it through, because you're doing the same thing 500 times a day, you had to find strategies for like getting through the day. And especially when you're working midnights, because you're like, oh, it's 3 a.m. and I'm only half done my shift. So I listened to a lot of hip hop really loud. And I tried to read books in between. You would like figure out how to do a job in 35 seconds instead of 42 seconds, because then you had 7 seconds to read. So I would read books. But there's no amount of money like per year. There's no amount of money in the world that I could ever do it again.
The factory was incredibly hard, grinding work. But that difficulty brought people together in a way.
I love Windsor people. I love blue-collar working class people. They're my people. Like some people were struggling. There were people who had drinking problems, and we had a really strong union. So people were maybe working who shouldn't have been working. But it was just like good people, with like families and kids, and who were just like working their tails off to like make good lives for their families. And, there were lots of, just like a mix of people. There were people there that had like PhDs. There were people who hadn't graduated high school. There were single moms, single dads, just a very broad range of humanity. And you were all kind of, it kind of felt like you were in a war together. So you had your buds and you had your like groups, and you'd go off and have your like lunch breaks and cigarettes together. And you kind of all felt like you were in this together.
For the first time in her life, Heather was making money. She was only 19 years old and making a pretty good wage.
I bought a lot of clothes. I had a really huge music CD habit because I was like, the only way I could get through the day was listening to music. So at the time, you know, like an import CD was like $28 Canadian. So I was probably spending like $500 or $600 a month on music. I didn't drink. I was never a drinker or partier. But yeah, I just bought a lot of stuff and didn't save as much money as I probably should have. Like when I finally moved to Montreal, I probably should have had a lot more money saved than I did. But yeah, I just like bought clothes and shoes and stuff for my house and music, and I don't know, was like financially irresponsible perhaps for the first time.
Because you had money for the first time to be irresponsible with.
Yeah. And it was like, oh, money, like look at all the things that I could buy for sure.
In her last year of university, Heather's best friend moved to Montreal. Heather had the chance to visit her.
I was like completely fell in love with this city. It's just this like this, I don't know. It's just this, it feels like a very Canadian city. It's like incredibly multicultural. The majority of the population feels French, which is this like Anglophone in Ontario felt so like exotic and beautiful to me. It's beautiful. There's like very European sensibility here, but it's also very gritty, and it's a poor city in a poor province. And so maybe it felt like a lot more comfortable to me than like something like Toronto does, which is a little bit more polished. So when I was finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And she was like, come to Montreal. And at the time, the factory, it was just when the automotive industry was doing really poorly. And the union ended up negotiating buyouts for people who had been there for like less than 5 years. So I got a good chunk of change basically to quit my job, basically give up my spot.
After moving to Montreal, Heather worked in what she describes as crappy service jobs. But she and her best friend also took an unusual step.
And Tereska and I, my best friend, like I had a little bit of money, she had a little bit of money. We bought a building, so we were landlords for a while, but both of us working like, she was like a bike messenger. I was working in like cafes. I don't really know how we pulled it off. It was a very lean couple of years.
In the meantime, she kept working in bars and restaurants in order to scrape together a living. It wasn't easy.
I mean, maybe the worst one was the first job when I got here, because if you're an Anglophone in Montreal, it's hard to get work. Like you have to really speak. If you can speak, if you're bilingual in the city, it's like the world is your oyster. But if you don't really speak French, you do end up working these kind of like bottom tier jobs. And so the first one I got was at this cigar bar, and it was owned by these like three big, gross, like they were complete misogynists. Like there's no other word for it. And it was just like the women that worked for them were chattel. And like we would work 12-hour shifts with high heels. Like if you showed up to work and weren't wearing heels, like you went home. And they really were obsessed with having regular customers. And so we were kind of indoctrinated with this like routine in order to get people to come back. Like it was just gross. It was a very gross, exploitive job. But it just, a lot of them feel that way. You know, I had a couple jobs that were a little bit better, but it just seemed to me in Montreal that a lot of the bar owners are just monsters. And there's always going to be another girl behind you waiting for your job. So there's no incentive for them to like treat their employees with dignity.
Between her service jobs and the house they owned, Heather wasn't making a lot of money. The problem was, breaking the spending habits she'd acquired before wasn't easy.
Well, when I moved to Montreal, I was really broke. And then we had the house. And so all of our money was going into the house. And so I ended up racking up like quite a bit of consumer debt because I was still spending money. Like I was making $60,000 a year. And so we ended up selling the house 3 or 4 years after we bought it, or 4 years after I bought it, because my best friend was getting married and she wanted to buy a place with her husband. And when we sold the house, it was like, I think it was $40,000 in debt, mostly consumer debt, and then a few student loans because I had gone back to school.
Heather was buying the same kinds of things she'd gotten used to buying when she had a fairly good income, like music and nice clothes.
I'd go and buy like a $200 pair of jeans and like go buy a pair. Like I was spending, you know, I was buying stuff every month with just this expectation, like things are going to work out. And like next month I'll pay off the Visa card and like it's all going to kind of miraculously work out. And it never did. And thank God we ended up selling the house and we made enough on the house that I could kind of finally like put all that consumer debt to it. Because if we hadn't done that, I'd still be paying that debt off.
Heather decided to go back to school. She was deciding between law school and a degree in interior design.
I was like, I'm either going to go into debt, like $30,000 into debt to go to law school. And at the time, it was like the economy wasn't doing super well. And there was, you know, all these articles about all these people coming out of law school and not being able to find jobs. And then also, I really love to read. And every lawyer I've ever met has just said, like, you're not going to read for pleasure anymore because all you do all day long is read. And it's the last thing you want to do when you get home. And I couldn't imagine a life without reading. So I was like, okay, maybe this isn't the plan. And then turned out I really loved design and I was really good at it. And it ended up being the perfect decision because design is, you're using your kind of left and right brain equally. So it's very creative, and it's also can be really analytical, which kind of appeals to me. So it's a very like engaged way of looking at the world.
When Heather graduated from design school, she was hired by a small firm. Most of the work there was designing shopping centers, kind of an odd thing for someone who was struggling with spending.
Like 80% of our work was shopping centers, mostly in Canada, mostly renovations. I worked on a huge one in the Middle East in Qatar. So like this insane luxury shopping center filled with like marble and brass and chandeliers and like literally $100,000 light fixtures.
She says this experience was really surreal.
So Qatar is really wealthy. Everybody's there is a millionaire. And it's basically like, I don't know if it's going to be quite like Dubai, but it is building up like Dubai. So our shopping center was like the 10th one that had gone up. And yeah, like just like money was really not an object. Like we were using marble everywhere, which you don't generally use because it's really expensive, especially when you're doing like tens and tens of thousands of square feet. Like I designed some crazy, crazy stuff for that place because the employees were getting paid pennies an hour. They're all like being imported from like Bangladesh and India, and they're not using hard hats. There's no safety regulations. So because labor is so cheap, you can kind of do whatever you want. And the Sheikh of Qatar is funding most of the project. So it's not necessarily like a capitalist entity that's in it to make money. It's just like an investment project for him. So it was just like a different way to work because you're not necessarily dealing with like a board who's making decisions based on what's the most cost effective. It was just like this guy who had all this money. It was like, make me a beautiful mall. It was a very weird experience.
The experience contrasted deeply with her background working in Canadian factories, as hard as that was.
We had already designed part of the mall a couple years ago. I hadn't worked on it. And so when I was brought in, my boss would tell me like going to on site and you're in a construction zone and there are guys walking around with no hard hats on, with like sneakers on, climbing up like 2-story ladders without like any kind of safety harness. Like it was crazy. So I don't know. As just coming from this union background, it was really a weird experience to be designing this building and knowing people were going to be abused in the construction.
Coming up, how Heather made the drastic change from an interior design career to launching her own sewing pattern company.
And then part of my own struggles with consumerism is realizing that like my desire for stuff is about wanting to feel like safe and secure and needing to have these things around me.
This podcast is created by the team at Seamwork. We're here to help you design and sew your own wardrobe. You can check out our patterns, classes, and community by visiting us at seamwork.com. If you like the idea of creating your own wardrobe but really struggle with actually making things that you want to wear, check out our free downloadable sewing planner. It's available at seamwork.com/go/planner. It's a totally free printable PDF, and you can use it to help you create a small collection of pieces that fits your style and your real life. It'll help you to define your goals, create a palette, design some looks, and then create a queue of projects to sew. Just visit seamwork.com/go/planner, enter your email address, and then we'll send it to you right away. We'll also send you a series of emails that gives you some tips and actually helps walk you through using the planner. So again, that URL is seamwork.com/go/planner, or just check for the link in the show notes. Heather Lewenza grew up in a working class area of Canada and worked in an auto factory all through college, going from having no money to making good money to very little money again. As her income changed, she had a lot of difficulty managing her spending, and she developed a lot of consumer debt.
So part of the incentive for me to start sewing was I had paid off most of my debt, but then I was like, I had like maybe another grand or two and just like visa debt that just happens, you know, you just like want something and you just are like, I'm going to get it. I'll put it on my visa. And I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I'm a grown up. Like this, you only spend money when you have money to spend. And so I had made a promise to myself. I was like, you're going to spend the next year. You're not going to buy anything new unless it's like you can buy thrifted clothes or you're going to learn how to sew and you're going to start making your own clothes. And so that's what I did. And I got completely obsessed.
At this point, Heather was working in a design firm, mostly working on shopping centers. The idea of making her own clothing was so freeing. She remembers the first thing she made.
It was like a John Volos designer pattern. It was just this like knit jersey dress. I actually just made it again in the spring. Yeah, it was just like this super simple kind of maxi dress. And yeah, it was like a vintage pattern. Because I remember discovering vintage patterns and then realizing like, oh my God, like I can make vintage dresses that fit me and that don't have pit stains and that aren't made out of polyester. And just that liberation was like, my brain exploded.
In 2011, she started her own sewing blog and started making friends with other sewing bloggers. She was absolutely obsessed with sewing, and she decided to try making her first pattern.
I had wanted this Norma Kamali swimsuit for years, and I had a seamstress at some point in like late, I don't know, maybe 2009. I'd sent her a photo, and I said, I want this swimsuit. She ended up like kind of making me this swimsuit. It wasn't perfect, but it was kind of like close to what I wanted. And then I found a vintage pattern that was like, had elements of what I wanted, but wasn't quite there. And so I ended up just using it as a block and redrafted it to kind of be exactly what I wanted. And then added another option. And then I'd taken photos of it and put it on the blog, and people were like, oh my God, you have to release this as a pattern. And initially I was like, oh, I'm just going to release it as like a free PDF pattern, share it. I might not even, grade it into different sizes. And then I started working on it. And I was like, this is an insane amount of work. Like I'm going to charge $10. I'm sure, if I sell 10 of them or 20 of them, it'll be worth the effort that I put into it. Taught myself to graded it. And like it ended up going really like kind of blew my mind how many people ended up making that swimsuit. Like to this day, I'm still like, whoa, like so many people have made that swimsuit and like posted pictures of themselves online in their swimsuit feeling amazing. Like I think, on my deathbed, that's going to be one of the things that I'm like the proudest of, that people made a swimsuit that made them feel beautiful on the beach for the first time. It's an amazing feeling.
Yeah, that's got to be incredible, especially for a swimsuit. I mean, that carries so much baggage for so many people.
Well, body-wise and just it's one of those things that if you've never made a swimsuit before, it's one of those people are intimidated and think it's hard. Something that I fight against in my own sewing practice and something that I like try to preach, I guess, but not preach, but just I kind of get frustrated with people, or not with people, but I get frustrated when I hear people say like, oh, I can't do that, or it's too hard, or like, I don't know how to sew that. The thing is, if you can operate a sewing machine, like you can make anything. Like the only thing holding you back is yourself. And so with the swimsuit, it's like, yeah, there can be challenging, but it's just having the right needle and practicing your stitches and having a couple little tricks, and like you can make it. And so the other thing that was great about that was like maybe people working with stretch fabrics or making a swimsuit for the first time, and then the confidence and the empowerment that comes from realizing like, oh, I can do this thing. Like this is so exciting. This thing I thought I couldn't do, I could do. And also I'm wearing a swimsuit and I feel amazing. Like the combination of those two factors is awesome.
Heather was in love with the freedom sewing gave to her, but also to other women who were now using her pattern. At the same time, she was getting very tired of designing shopping centers.
I was just getting really bored, and I was working on like the 10th Mallscape, like furniture package, which is like the furniture in the malls that you sit on when you're, taking breaks. And I have designed so much of that furniture. If there was a nuclear holocaust, the only thing that's going to survive are the cockroaches and those stupid benches that I designed, because kids jump all over them and they're getting like bumped by cleaning machines. And I was working on like the 10th. I'm like, if I have to design one more of these benches, I'm going to kill myself.
Making things opened up a whole new world to her, something outside of her job that fulfilled a deeper need.
I think like a lot of us have office jobs and have things that we're doing to pay the bills that aren't necessarily the most like spiritually fulfilling, and that there's something very psychologically and emotionally gratifying about making things.
She was also having a hard time meeting people to date in Montreal. She started questioning her path.
So I was having a hard time dating, and I was bored at work, and I was thinking about like moving to Toronto. And then one day I just really had this moment where I was like, well, why don't you try and release another pattern? Like your passion is sewing. Like you love sewing more than anything else in the world. The bombshell did really well. Maybe just work on another one. This bodysuit pattern I had, this idea I had, I was like, nobody else has done this. Let's just see. And so I talked to my dad about it, and I was like, Dad, I want to quit my job. I'm going to design patterns. This is like January of last year. Like, I want to quit now. Like, I can't do it. I can't take it anymore. I'm so bored at work. And he was like, no, Heather, like you have no money saved. You just have to put your head down, suck it up for the next 6 months, save as much money as you can. So that's what I did. I just worked my butt off. I like stayed after work and like worked on Netty. I saved as much money as I possibly could. And when I had that decision and kind of the whole idea for my business came in, I knew how I wanted to name the patterns. I knew like what I wanted the brand to stand for. I knew what I wanted my mission to be. Like all of that stuff kind of came to me really quickly. And so I just had this, like, I had the fire.
Finally, Heather left her job to dedicate herself to closet case files full-time. She describes her concept as elevated basics, things you can wear every day but are still a learning experience to sew, like her ginger jeans pattern. She says every pattern is like a university education for her.
But in the end, it's like I become really good at this thing and then hopefully can help other people get better at this thing. But it is like an absolute insane amount of work, especially when you're working on more complicated stuff. And because I'm still working on all my blocks, like I'm still working on my knit block and I'm working on my bodice block and I'm working on my pants block, I'm also like building the infrastructure for that. So it's like on the front end, I'm sure it'll get easier as time goes on. But right now, at times feels very overwhelming.
When we talked, Heather was working on her latest pattern, the Claire coat.
I don't think this coat is going to sell as well as other patterns because it's just one of those things. People hear coat, they get intimidated. It's like a lot of little things that you have to source. And it's not something that you can like make in an afternoon when your kid's having a nap or, you know, you have the day off. Like, so I understand it's not going to sell, but I personally just kind of have to put it out there and just see, because on the other hand, I think that there's a big underserved market of makers who like want to make more complicated things and don't want to make another shift dress and want to be challenged and want to learn. And I remember when I released Ginger Jeans, it was only the third pattern, but the first week was like kind of the sales were a little disappointing. I was like, oh my God, I have like killed myself working on this pattern. Like I've worked so hard on this pattern and it's just not selling. And what am I doing? And I had quit my job at that point. And I was like, this is supposed to be like how I'm going to pay the rent. Like, what am I doing with my life? But it was really funny because a couple people, you know, people bought it and then they started blogging about it and they were like, oh my God, like making jeans isn't that hard. And then it kind of caught on. And for like a month, it felt like the tsunami of ginger jeans. Like every blog, people were wearing jeans and being so excited and being like, oh my God, I made jeans. That was this huge moment for me where I was like, there is a market for things that are more complicated. I think the secret is just holding people's hands through it and like, as my father would say, like pumping sunshine at people's butts and just like telling them that they can do it and being really positive and like providing like an infrastructure, like doing the sew along and everything else. And they're like showing people how they can do it. For my own mental sanity, we'll probably, you know, every other pattern do something more simple just so I'm not like crying every night. But I do really like the more complicated patterns because it's a challenge for me. And I think there's something really awesome about people discovering new talents and new skills and learning to like push themselves in their practice.
I asked Heather how her money situation had changed since starting her own company.
My like income got cut. Well, I was making nothing basically when I quit my job because I had a little bit of money coming in from the Bombshell, but it wasn't until I would say like over 6 months in that I started making enough that I could stop spending savings and stuff like that. And now like I've kind of blown through all of the savings that I had, but I'm making enough now to get by. And I'm still not making as much money as I was making at my old job, and I'm working way more. But I feel now like I'm working towards something and I'm building something as opposed to just kind of clocking time.
How do you feel when you're in a mall now?
I hate it. The smell. There's this smell. I don't know. I think they spray all the clothes with like these chemicals to keep things from getting wrinkled. And if you go and you touch, it just everything smells like chemicals. And especially if you go into like a cheaper store with everything is like the synthetic fabric where you feel like you'd set on fire if like somebody threw a match at you. Yeah, I just can't be in them anymore. And it's also because I worked on them for so long. And so I look at the stupid mallscape furniture and I'm like, get me out of here.
Nowadays, Heather hardly ever buys clothing anymore.
Every once in a while, I'll pick up a t-shirt or something, but I don't really shop. I'm not in stores anymore. I hate being in malls. Yeah, 95% of the clothing that comes into my closet now is stuff I've made or it's come from clothing swaps. Like I very, very rarely buy anything new anymore.
Even though sewing doesn't necessarily save a ton of money, she feels like it gives her an entirely different perspective on the role of material goods in our lives.
I feel like spiritually we're a little adrift right now, at least those of us in like Western culture. We don't really have ritual anymore. You know, our sense of community is very fractured. People live alone. They don't know their neighbors. You know, young people like move far away from home. They're not close to their families anymore. We don't make anything anymore. You know, like in America or Canada, like everything has been shipped overseas. Like we don't have any connection to the things that we touch or use. Our food is, you know, chemically like filled with additives and chemicals. And, you know, we're like torturing animals to eat meat. Like it's just like we're in a very weird place where it's like we've figured out industrialization, but we haven't figured out how to make it humane. And I feel like a lot of people just feel, even if they're not conscious of that, they feel that. And I think that's why like there's been this, you know, rise of like fundamentalism and all of these different ways is just people feeling disconnected and hopeless. And, you know, that kind of like rigid answer feels good. It's like, okay, this makes me feel confident and secure that this is the answer. But I think it's just kind of tied into this much bigger issue is just that we're all told that we just need to buy all this stuff all the time.
Heather Lewenza is the owner and designer of Closet Case Files Patterns. You can find Heather at closetcasefiles.com or on Instagram at HeatherLou. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.